All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 5th session in the series, The Laws of Kashrut and Jewish-Gentile Relations by Dr. Shana Strauch Schick. And now without delay, I'll turn this to Dr. Strauch Schick.
Thank you so much. And it's nice to see everyone again as we can continue and hopefully complete our study of Pat Akum, the prohibition against eating bread that's been baked by a non-Jew. Now, just to review, just share my screen with my PowerPoint presentation. We've all seen a bunch of times, but so we saw in the Shana Avodah Zarah that there's a prohibition, amongst other things, that the rabbis decreed against eating pat v'hashem shalahen, the bread and the oil, the bread baked by a non-Jew, and oil produced by non-Jews, and oil was allowed. And then we saw the Bavli text on this Shana, on the prohibition against eating bread, where we kind of saw a back and forth about the issue. We saw that first we examined the relationship between this prohibition against eating the bread baked by a non-Jew as against the more general prohibition against eating food cooked by a non-Jew, and is this just this just another example of bishul akum, or is pat akum its own prohibition? We saw Haran say they really are the same, but they were made at 2 different times. First came pat akum, then came bishul akum later on. We saw the Ran give a different explanation that really these are not the same prohibitions. Then pat akum is a prohibition which is much more strict and severe than a bishul akum, and as long as a non-Jew owns the bread, a Jew is not ever allowed to eat it at all, whereas bishul akum, as long as the Jew is involved in the cooking process in some way, then it is allowed. And the Rambam is like the Ram, but different in that he explains that pat akum and bishul akum are not the same prohibition. However, pat akum is more lenient than a bishul akum, and whereas in pat akum a Jew can just be involved in a very minimal symbolic way, whereas in a bishul akum the Jew has to be involved in a much more meaningful way. Then we saw the Bavli sugya, as I was mentioning before, bring different opinions as to whether Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi ever revoked the prohibition against pat akum or not. And it was kind of 2 opinions about this in the Gemara. And we saw the Yerushalmi, which said that pat akum had been revoked by the rabbis in Kesaria, and it seems other places in the land of Israel as well. And then we went to the medieval Rishonim to try to understand why pat akum isn't really relevant back then, certainly during medieval times, and even today as well. We saw the Tosafos say that, well, since even originally the prohibition against eating pat akum never spread to all the communities of the Jewish people, therefore, if you live in a place where people eat pat akum, you must be in a place where either the prohibition never spread in the first place or where the court revoked it. We saw the Rush who say, well, either like the Tosafos, it didn't spread to all the countries, and therefore we don't have to observe it. Or if you live in a place where the prohibition did spread, nevertheless, if there's no Jewish baker, then it's an issue of chaye nefesh. It's like a matter of life. Bread was the main source of food that people ate, and if you don't have any bread to eat, then people will effectively starve. I believe we left off with the Ran, who explained that why can we be lenient? Either because that's the view in the Yerushalmi, or even the Bavli itself did have views which are lenient. Rev Adim, going back to the Gemara, Rev Adimi and Rev Yosef might have said that Rebbe never permitted pat akum, But then we saw the opinions of Reb Chalbo and Rabbi Yochanan, who said, well, that a bread, pat akum, is allowed either if there's no Jewish baker, or if you live in a field. And in a field, there's less of a concern of intermarriage, because the assumption is the meals people have are not like a formal sit-down meal, more of an impromptu kind of eating on the go. And there's no concern that more meaningful relationships will form and ultimately lead to intermarriage. So the Ran says we don't only have to look to the Yerushalmi to be lenient, even within the Bavli itself, there is room to be lenient. And we now turn to the Rambam, which is the next source on the page. So let me just share the text so everyone can see where we are. So we're in the Rambam now. He writes, Afal pish asru pat akum, even though pat akum, the bread baked by non-Jew, is prohibited by the Mishnah, yesh mekomot shemekilin b'davar v'lochim pat hanachtum ha'akum. There are places where people are lenient and they buy the bread of a non-Jewish baker. B'makom she'ein sham nachton Yisrael. Either it's a place where there's no Jewish baker, u b'sadeh, and it's in a field, mipnei shushat techak. Because clearly, if there's no Jewish baker, then it's a pressing matter. There won't be any food for people to eat, and we have to allow that. But to have the bread of a regular non-baker, a regular non-Jew, you're a non-Jewish neighbor, in shan mishmore halakhah. There's no one who would be lenient about that. Sheikar hagezera mishum chatnut, because the main reason, the basis for prohibiting pat akum, is the fear that it'll ultimately lead to intermarriage. If you eat the bread of just a regular non-Jew and non-professional, yavo l'soda etzlam, you might come to eat with them. If you eat with them, that will form a more meaningful relationship. So the Rambam allows for those, he's clearly relying on the Bavli. Let me just go back to the other share. To those two additions which were presented in the Bavli, he's gleaning both from Reb Chalbo and Rabbi Yochanan, that meaning that these two opinions work together. That pat akum, the bread of a Jewish baker, is allowed only when there's no Jewish baker, per Reb Chalbo, and it's in a field per Rabbi Yochanan. So he uses both of these opinions and says that they work together to both allow pat akum, but to also limit it to both of these conditions of being met. Now, finally, let's look at the Ran, which is the next horse after the Rambam, and I'll just have it here. So, and he is lenient, like both of these opinions as well, and even more than them. And he writes, first he says, Lepum maskana de gemara dilan namihu atar. According to the conclusion of the Bavli, even the Bavli, pat akum would be allowed. Elavade amurai ninhu de Rabbi Yosef svirele de Rabbi Lohiter b'pakla elasha olam ta'u bekach. But it's not the opinion of everyone in the Bavli. Rather, it's a dispute amongst the Amoraim, amongst the rabbis in the Bavli, with Rabbi Yosef and Rev Adimi saying Rebbe never allowed pat akum. V'ikamante apalegalev amar de Rebbe hitir et pat. But others who appear in the Bavli disagree and say that Rebbe did allow the bread of a non-Jew. Reb Chalbo, Rebbe Yochanan shaklu v'taryu aliva demand amar hachi. And those two opinions, sorry, let me go back to this. those two opinions of Reb Chalbo and Rabbi Yochanan, they are according to the views that Rebbe did permit pat akum. So it's a dispute between Reb Adimi and Reb Yosef on the one hand, who held Rebbe never permitted pat akum. They're on one side of the argument, and on the other side is Reb Chabot and Rabbi Yochanan, who say Rebbe did allow pat akum, and they just differ as to how he allowed it. Either he allowed it where there's no Jewish baker, or he allowed it in the field. Okay, and continuing in the Ran, the Ula Inyan, I'm just skipping now to the end of the third line after the three dots. Ula Inyan mi sheyesh lo pat bisalo velokeach mi apalter oved kochavim mipnei chashivuto shel pat kemo shnoagim ach hashav harashba hitiru. So even one who has a bread, you have access to other bread, but you nevertheless like the bread of the non-Jewish baker more. So you have access to a Grunbaum's challah, but you really like Thomas's English muffins more. They just are better. They're unique. They're not made by any Jewish baker. The Rashba allows that. Why? Dekeva, and that's the Rashba, B'Shem Rabo Harav Rabbeinu Yonah. The Rashba allowed that in the name of his teacher, Rabbeinu Yonah. Dekevan Shutar Pat Shal Apalter Lagamre. Since we do allow, once we have already allowed the bread of a non-Jewish baker, as we see here, once we already allowed that, Hutra kohecha deleka palter Yisrael. We allow it anytime there's no Jewish baker. And kevan shadato shel adam nocha yoter biphat shel apalter mipnei chashivuto harezeu kepat dechukalo. And if you really like the non-Jewish bread more, even though you actually do have access to Jewish baked bread, it's as if it's a shat halakhah. It's as if it's this emergency almost. It's as if you don't have bread. And you're allowed to eat the non-Jewish bread. So not only are you allowed to eat non-Jewish baker's bread when there's no Jewish baker available, but you're even allowed to eat non-Jewish baked bread where you just like the non-Jewish brand better. It's artisan bread and it's not available by a Jewish baker. That's an additional reason to allow pat akum, says the Ran. And he concludes here, Chen hadin hecha sheish al palter Yisrael. And this is the rule. Even where there is a Jewish baker, el shapat shalab palter oved kochavim na'eh menu. But it's just the bread of the non-Jewish baker is better. That is an additional reason to be lenient. So all these different reasons we have seen, either as Atosa and LaRush say, the prohibition never spread to every place amongst all the Jews. So either you live in a place where that prohibition never spread, or the Beit Din has the right to revoke this prohibition. Or as the Ran says, we follow the more lenient opinion in the Babli. Or as the Rambam says, if you're in a field and there's no Jewish baker. And then lastly, we saw the Ran say, if the non-Jewish bakery bread is just better, you like it more, that's as if you're in a place where there's no Jewish baker. The way the halakhah has been codified, we find both these views, both the Shulchan Aruch following the more limited leniency of the Rambam, whereas the Ramah goes with the more broader leniency of the Ashkenazim. And let's just read the next source together. I'll stop the share and do the other share now. Okay, so the next source, the Shulchan Aruch rules as follows. This is in Siman Kuf Yud Sif Bet. Yesh mikomot shemekilim bedavar. There are places where they are lenient. Velochim pat me nachtom haoved kochavim, and people do buy bread from non-Jewish bakers. B'makom she'ein sham nachton Yisrael, and this is in a place where there's no Jewish baker, mipnei shushat halakhah, because it's like a pressing need, because you need bread. So he's like the Rambam. However, unlike the Rambam, he doesn't limit it to the field. He says as long as there's no Jewish baker, and it seems to be any place, it's as if there's a real need, and he seems to be more in line with the Rush in this regard, who we had seen last time. The Ramah, however, adds a huge leniency, and he writes, "V'yesh omrim afilu b'makom shepat Yisrael matzoy share." And there are those who say that even if you're in a place where there is a Jewish baker, it is still allowed to have non-Jewish bakers' bread. That's the Ramah. So you don't even need to be in a place where you don't have any access to Jewish baked bread. Even if they're Jewish bakers, you can always have the baked goods of a non-Jewish baker. And this is not limited to what the Ran said of you like it more or it's better. The Ramah doesn't qualify this. Then returning to the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef of Cairo, he writes about pat shal bale abatim ein sham mi shemoreh bal hakel. But the bread of a regular non-Jew, a baker, a friend, there's no one who's lenient about that. Shikar hagezera mishum chatnut. This is now verbatim like the Rambam, because the main reason for the decree is the fear of intermarriage. And if you eat the bread of a regular non-Jew, you'll come to eat with them. That leads to relationships and intermarriage down the road. So that's the Shulchan Aruch. And once again, the Ramah qualifies this and adds a leniency. Haga, this is a note again by the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles. Below mikreb bale habayit ela im aso libnei beito. It's only called the bread of a regular non-Jew if the non-Jew made the bread for the people in their household. Aval im aso limchor. But if they bake the bread to sell, Mikre apalter, this is called a baker's bread. Afal pi she'ein darko bikach. Even though they're not a baker, they don't normally sell a bread. As long as this bread that you want to eat for them, they didn't make for their household, they made it to sell. That's not the bread of a Baal Habayit. That's not the bread of a regular non-Jew. That is the bread of a non-Jewish baker. And likewise, the opposite. If a non-Jewish baker baked bread for themselves, that's you can't eat that bread, because that would be the bread of a Baal Habayit, of a regular person. Now, the Strauch comments on the leniency of the Ramah, where it writes Yesh Mikamot, where the Shulchan Aruch wrote that there are places which are very lenient about pat akum and buy the bread of a non-Jewish baker. The Strauch comments that lo dame lishlakot. Pat akum is not like a bishul hakum, which we learned about. Whereas a bishul hakum, no one's lenient about. Yeah, we are lenient in what we consider being involved in the cooking process, but we would never say that bishul akum doesn't apply. I mean, if we would never say that there's no prohibition against bishul akum, that there people don't observe bishul akum. Maybe there are ways to be lenient about it if the Jew is involved. If it's in the Jew's home and everything we have learned. But pat akum is not like a bishul akum. Whereas in the case of a bishul akum, lo nagu heter b'shum akum, there's no place where a bishul akum isn't operative. But why are we so lenient about pat akum? Al pat yechya ha'adam. Because people need bread to live. V'shayach batama de Yerushalmi. The reasoning we had seen in the Yerushalmi applies. Dechaye nefesh. It's a matter of saving a life. You need bread to live. This is why we're also very lenient with regard to bread, as we'll learn soon, that tossing a straw into the fire works, even in cases where pat akum would be operative. So that's one reason the Shach brings why we are so lenient about bread, because people need bread to live. Bread is the basis of a diet for much of history, which is not the case with other foods. And he brings the Shach brings an additional reason why we are lenient, which we've already seen earlier, that he's echoing the opinion of the Tosafist, and he writes, Mordechai katabatam otam mekomo hanogim heter hanu mishum delo nitpashet ha'isor pat she'oved kochavim v'techilat ha'gezerah ba'otan mekomot. So this is what we've seen, that the original prohibition never spread all over. Again, we have already seen this, that the prohibition against eating pat akum never spread to all the Jewish people. Okay, but now he goes one step further. According to this, mashma afilu pat shal bale batim mutar. If the reason you can be lenient is that you live in a place where the prohibition never spread in the first place, that would mean that one could even eat the bread of a regular non-Jew and not just the bread of a non-Jewish baker. Daha lo nitpashet klal isor pat shalved kochavim ba'otam mekomot. If you're lenient, that must show that you live in a place where the prohibition never spread in the first place, and therefore you don't need those other reasons of there's no Jewish baker, you're in the field. Those only apply if you're in a place where the prohibition already was, and now you have leniencies to work around it. But if you're in a place where the people are just generally lenient, and thus it's a place where the prohibition never spread, that would mean it never was there at all, and any non-Jewish bread would be allowed. Now that would, of course, beg the question of, so what comes first, the people not observing it, or this reasoning that it never spread there? And how do you know if you're in such a place? So, I'm not sure, but as I mentioned a few times, the reality in medieval Ashkenaz was that people did not own their own ovens. I have a picture of what this looked like. Now, people could own a small oven in their home where they cook other types of food. But the way that bread was made, it had to be made in these very large communal ovens known as for panal. Someone's French, they can say that better than I could. And these are very, very large, and they were big fire hazards. So therefore, under the feudal system, and then later under the guilds, no one can own their own oven for a baking bread like this. It had there was one for a village, for a town, for a city. And if earlier on during the time of Rashi, Jews may have been able to operate such ovens and even own them, we see that by the 12th and 13th centuries, during the times of Rabbeinu Tam, in many cases it was just impossible or just not a reality for a Jew to own this and operate it. So very often in medieval times in Europe, Jews were just not able to own or operate the ovens necessary for baking a bread. So this was just, the reality was there may really, for many Jews, have been no other bread available other than pat hakum, other than the bread baked by a non-Jew. Now, what that says about us, where we do have bread available, we do have, many Jewish brands available, why that's still operative, if it is, that's certainly a question that we will address shortly as we go on to later times. But we see the Ramah, who's living in modern Europe, 1700s, 1800s. He's still attaining the akulot of the Ashkenazim for him, and allowing pat akum. And it seems in Ashkenaz the leniencies with regard to pat akum remained in a place during the time of the Shach as well. And so Kashrut organizations nowadays give hashgacha to the bread baked by a non-Jew. And many of us eat Thomas's English muffins. I don't know, but I don't think there's a Jewish person there turning on the oven, but I can certainly be wrong. But we eat pat hakum, and for various reasons. It could be the reason of the run. No kosher company makes anything as great as Thomas's English muffins or the artisan breads and Trader Joe's. But the general practice is to be lenient with regard to pat akum. But there is a time during the year when we are machmir, when we are strict about pat akum, and that is during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the days in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I have to say, living in Israel, pat akum is really not much of an issue that you don't really think about, because even in places where non-Jews are making the food, there's just Jews on the premises all the time, and so it's really pat akum is not such a thing. But this year, actually, I flew to the U.S. Motzei Rosh Hashanah, and after the Tzom Gedalia, I bought bread to eat, and I realized, oh shoot, this is pat akum. I totally forgot to look at this, and I couldn't eat the Trader Joe's bread I had bought. So let's now examine this custom to be strict about pat akum during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah.
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, it's just I guess more in general topic of bishul akum and pat akum. So pat akum, it seems like you try to find leniencies because bread is essential, like an essential thing to live. But at the end of the day, for bishul akum, there's always kind of a way to do it, like just stoking the coals. There's always a way to do bishul akum, but there's not always a scenario when you could do pat akum. So in a way, it seems stricter.
But you don't need it. That's the point. Like a kashrut organization will give a brand, a hashgacha, even if there was a Jew there turning on the oven. Whereas in a bishul akum, it takes more to earn the kashrut certification. Now, of course, remember, we have all those factors. It is a food that can be eaten raw, then there's no bishul akum. Would this be served on a king's table? There's no bishul akum. So we do have, some ways to make bishul akum not an issue, but where it is an issue, a Jew would have to be involved in order to make it kosher.
Okay.
Now, right after we talk about Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, we'll get to what do you do about those foods that we're not sure if they're bread and fall under pat akum or a bishul akum. In which case, could they get a kashrut certification if there's no Jew involved or not? So, yeah, it's easy to take care of a bishul akum, but you still need the presence of a Jew. Whereas in the case of a pat akum, you don't even need a Jew there to make it kosher. You can't have non-kosher ingredients, of course. So, but you don't need the Jew there to turn on the oven to make it okay. Okay, so in terms of Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, why is there a custom to be strict? What does pat akum have to do with Aseret Yemei Teshuvah? So the Rush, again, our Rush we keep seeing, writes as follows. And again, he quotes another Gemara from the Yerushalmi. Rush writes, the next source, we're in section number 4, the custom to be strict during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, and this is on top of page 5. So he writes, Yerushalmi b'Perakama de Shabbat, in the Yerushalmi, the first chapter of Tractate Shabbat, says Rebbe Chia Rabba Mafkid L'Rab Yata Yachol L'Mecha Akula Shata B'Tahara Achol. So Rebbe Chia, the elder, said to Rav, if you all year round can eat food in a state of purity, you should do that. V'ilo, but if you're not able to always eat food in a state of physical purity, achol shiva yamim bishhata, at least eat in purity the 7 days of the year. What are those 7 days of the year? So the Rosh now explains the Hatav Rabbi Ha'ezri. So the Rabbi writes, Ki abalti she'elu sheva yamim hein shebein Rosh Hashanah liyom HaKippurim. These 7 days that Rav was told to eat in a state of purity, those are the 7 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the 10 days of Teshuvah. 10 includes 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and 1 day of Yom Kippur. So that's the Yerushalmi, that Rav was told, if you're not able to maintain a constant state of ritual purity during the year, at least be pure, at least eat your food in purity during these days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And now the Rosh writes, Al Kain Nahagu be'Ashkenaz Af Otan she'ein nizharim mipat shel nachrim kol hashana basar imei hatshuva nizharim. Based on this, says the Rosh, those Jews in Ashkenaz, those Jews in medieval Europe, who are not able to observe Pat Hakum all year round, they are careful to not eat Pat Akum during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, during the 7 days between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. So there's no Talmudic basis to be strict about Pat Akum, but it seems that the Jews of Ashkenaz inferred from this Yerushalmi about attaining a pure state during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, meaning if you're not able to attain this ideal during the year, at least do it during these days of Teshuvah. And they inferred from that, or they applied this to the concept of Pat Akum as well. And the Shulchan Aruch cites this, the halakhah, writes next the source, even those who are not careful, again, and even those who eat Pat Hakum, those who are not careful against eating the bread of a non-Jew, should be careful during the days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. And the Levush, in the next text we have, explains what is the connection between this idea of purity regarding, that we saw in the Yerushalmi, and the prohibition against eating Pat Akum, that this idea was applied to in a practice. So writes the Levush, Afilu mi shelo nizar mipat shel goyim b'shar yemot hashana noagim lizaher bo b'chosar yemei teshuvah hana Rosh Hashanah ad Yom Kippur. So even those who are not careful against eating Pat Akum during the rest of the year are careful to not eat it during the days between Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, kedei lahanhig atzmo b'tahara, in order to conduct yourselves with this extra level of purity. Afilu hayamim, be'elu hayamim, during these days. And why do we want to have this extra level of tahara, this extra level of purity during these days? Liskor shehein mishunim, to remind us that these days are unlike other days. These are different. L'ma'al yoter mishar yemot hashana, to elevate them from other days of the year. And if you're not able to bake it, if you live in one of those places where there's one oven for everyone, at least he says Yashir et hatanor she'ofim bo hagoyim. Maybe you be the one to purify the oven. You like a kashrut before the non-Jew cooks in it. Shiashlech bo Yisrael kisei mechad kedei she'nir'eh kimisayeh be'afiyata. Throw in a twig to the fire so that it looks like you are attributing to the baking. Kedei la'alot al levavenu she'anu muvejalim mehem. To imprint on our hearts that we are not like them, that we are separate, the kedusha in holiness, uv'tahara, and in purity. And why do we want to do that? V'na'aseh teshuvah. So this will inspire us to repent, to do a better. So it's to remind us that we should be on a higher level. We should be holier than we are during the rest of the year, and therefore that should help spur us to do teshuvah, to repent during these days. And I think what we can, see the relationship between the two is that patakum, maybe it is an ideal thing to do, and it's brought in the Mishnah. Just like on Yom Kippur, we try to be our ideal beings by being like angels. We don't eat. I try to be on a level unlike the rest of the year. But we realize that we can't be angels all year. We can't, pray all day, every single day. We can't not eat. So we set aside this day to be unlike the rest of the year, and to elevate it in holiness and purity. And Pat Akum, the way kind of things worked out, that's also an ideal that we weren't able to attain the rest of the year. It just wasn't possible. It didn't work with the reality of Jews for a very long time. So taking the lesson of Yom Kippur, and just as we elevate ourselves during Yom Kippur to be like angels, so we can elevate ourselves during this time to refrain from Pat Akum. So it's not as a far-fetched relationship as maybe it seems at first glance. And it takes the message of Yom Kippur of living an ideal that we're not always able to maintain, and applying it to Pat Akum as well, which ended up being an ideal that was unattainable to maintain for a long time. So that is a custom observed by many to refrain from eating Pat Akum during this time. And so when I came home from Trader Joe's on some Gedalia, or actually since I was in quarantine, I did order the food. Maybe it was from Whole Foods, I don't remember. And I saw, it has a halakhah, but it says Pat Akum, or it doesn't say Pat Yisrael on it. I refrained from eating it, but I did use it to break my fast after Yom Kippur when it was over. Okay, now moving to the next kind of sub topic here, number 5. We're now going to turn to a category of food whose status is unclear, whether it's a bread, and thus the laws or the leniencies of Pat Akum would be applicable, or if it's a cooked food, and thus the more stringent Bishul Akum would apply. So this is a category called Pat Hababikisin, and it's defined as like a dough-like food, but it had like a fruit, a juice mixed into it, and it would be things like cake, a bread, a kugel, sometimes a pizza, a pan of cakes. These are all foods that in the laws of brachot, of blessings, the question is, are these more like bread? And therefore you would have to wash, say hamotzi and say birkat hamazon on them, or are these not bread and you'd bless, you make a note and an al hamichia on them. So it's a question in Hilchot Brachot. And the law will depend on whether you are a seudah, whether you establish a meal on it. So that's why some people say if you only have one slice of pizza, then that's not a meal. You'd only have to say some notes and say al hamichya. And they would say only if you have a lot that would be like really a meal, would you have to wash and say birkat hamazon. Someone, the Rama says, people are eating these huge kiddushes at shul with, cookies and crackers and cakes, and they should be washing, and they're not. But what can I do? I'm not going to tell that everyone they're doing the wrong thing, or they're not going to listen anyways. But it seems to imply that if you're eating a large amount of cakes and cookies, that it would be like a meal. You could wash on it. Do you wash on pancakes or not? Maybe it depends on how many you eat. So pat hababe kisn is a category whose status raises halachic questions. Now, with regard to our kashrut one, the question is it like bread or is it like a cooked food? So a Tosfot deals with this in the next source we have. So, and he writes the next text, Kamash Malan de Akimcha Hu Ikar. Akimcha Ikar, that flour is the main ingredient here. Votan Nilaish Midalo Mevarchen Alai Birchat Hamotzi Yesh Bahen Mishum Bishule Nachrim. So this kind of dough food, which had, I think, like a kreplach kind of thing. Some say, since you don't say hamotzi, since you don't wash and say hamotzi on it, then it would have the status of a bishul akumen. You'd need a Jew to be involved in the cooking. Mihu, however, Amar HaReb Yechiel, De'ein Bahem Mishum Bet Nun is Hishul Nachrim. However, Reb Yechiel says they do not constitute a bishul hakum. Why? He gives two reasons. Kevan, because one, the derech afiat pat avid lehu, it's baked like a bread. That's the first thing. It's made like bread. Ve'od, and furthermore, di'i kava seudate alayhu, if you were to establish your meal around it, mevarech pirchat hamotzi, then you would wash and say hamotzi on it. Alma, consequently, pat minhu, it has the status of a bread. So, for a Tosfot, if there is a food which is both baked like bread, and you could be koveya a seuda on it, you could wash if you had, a lot of it, then you could be more lenient and treat it like pat akum and not a bishul akum. So according to this, since pizza is a food that you can be koveya a seuda on, you wouldn't need a Jew to be involved in the process of making a pizza, since it's made like bread, and you could theoretically eat a lot of it and thereby wash on it. And this would apply to donuts and Timon's donuts. These are all things which would constitute parababe a kisnin. So that's the view of the Tosafist. Let's move, jump in time to the Ramah to see how he codified the halakhah. He writes, Haga, a note, Otan milush shekorim kichlich. So those in English, we call kichel. So again, it's like a bereka kind of thing. O mine mitika shekorim laikich. Or, wheat kind of baked goods. Him b'chlal pot. These are considered a bread. And in a place where you are lenient with regard to pat akum, gam heim mutarim, even these are allowed. And we do not say that bishul akum applies to them. We apply the laws of pat akum and all the leniencies which that entails. Then he says, there are some which they like add lard onto, so those you should be strict about. Yesh minei milush krim kichlech she'ofin otam al barzalim moshem habarzal b'shatafiyah b'chelev chazir. Now there are some of these things which they make in an oven rack that's been like wiped with lard or a pig. Obviously, those we don't eat, because they may have some trait food that's been absorbed into it. And that's the custom. So any food which you could be a koveya a suda, you could wash on it. You could, you could establish a meal on it. So any kind of baked good, which is, made, it's baked like bread, and you could wash on it, that has the status, a pot, hababit, a kisnin. Actually, a donut, since they're boiled, maybe, I don't totally know, so maybe that wouldn't be the case, but cookies and cakes, donuts are fried, sorry. Cookies or cakes, which are baked, pizza, those would all have the status of pat hababit kisnin, which is pat hakum, and the leniency to pat hakum would apply. Now the Shach brings somewhat of a qualifier on this, and he writes in the next source, adafka shebililatan hava. They have to have a thick mixture, not like a liquidy one, like a pan cake. V'yesh bahen toar lechem. They also have to take the shape of bread. So that would perhaps limit a thinner mixture, like a pan cake, because that's more liquidy. It's not a thick mixture like a cookie or a liquidy. A cake wouldn't fall under this for the shach. It has to, rise and take the shape of bread. So only a thick dough would be considered pat hababit kisnin to get the leniency of pat hakum. And he also explains, why this leniency works. And he writes, and then the Ataz explains, since you would establish your meal around these foods, mevarech hamotzi, you would bless hamotzi, and alkain dinan kepat mamash. Since you would bless hamotzi on it, it's as if they are actual bread, and thus the leniency of pat hakum would apply. So to sum this up, if you have a zonot food, which has a thick batter, and you could establish a meal out of meat, you could wash and say hamotzi, meaning like a pasta you could never wash on. You couldn't be koveya a suda on that. So pasta cannot have the status of bread or therefore pat hakum. But if you have a food that has a thick dough, like a pizza, you could wash on it, then that's treated like pat hakum. Okay. The leniency of tossing the stick into a fire, which was a dispute between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim with regard to bishul hakum, for everyone applies to pat hakum, because that was in the Gemara and the Babli itself. And thus, in the number 6 here, tossing a stick into the fire, the Shulchan Aruch rules as follows: This is a line we've seen a lot. If the non-Jew lights the oven and the Jew bakes in it, or the Jew lights the fire and a non-Jew bakes in it, or a non-Jew lit the oven and a non-Jew baked in the oven, but a Jew came and made the fire a little bigger. Hare ze mu'atar. This bread is now allowed. This is not pat hakum anymore. Even if all the Jew did was throw a tiny stick into the fire. All the bread in this huge oven we saw before would be allowed. Because as the Rambam said, the Shulchan Aruch reiterates, all you need is a heker. You just need a symbolic act to remind you shapa shalahen asura, that their bread is prohibited. And that's how the Shulchan Aruch writes, that throwing a stick into the fire, it works. And Harash, though he agrees a little bit hesitatingly, and he writes, first the Rush writes, this is the Rambam, the Rambam Katashulos Rek Israel, Afilu Eitz Achal Tocha Tanur, Hitir Kol Hapat Shabo, on the top of page 6. The Rush quotes the Rambam, who says that even if all a Jewish throw a stick in, that works. Because again, all this is meant to be is a symbolic act. Shapat shalved kochavim asura, to remind you that non-Jewish bread is prohibited. However, the Rush says, Lishna de Gemara lo mashmahachi. He says, actually, I know the Rambam writes this, but this is not at all implied from the language of the Gemara. I'll share my screen. Because remember, the Gemara never said throwing a stick in. That's an act we only saw added by the later medieval Rishonim. And Harash points out the fact that tossing in a stick could work, that's never found in the Gemara. Nevertheless, he says, Hanach l'Yisrael shiyu shogegim. I'm not going to tell everyone this is wrong. No one's going to listen to me. And better that people sin inadvertently than know it's wrong and sin purposely. So Harash says, I don't really see this as an effective leniency. He thinks the Jew has to be much more involved in the process of baking, but he says is what people do, so what can I do? So that's the view of the Rush. And one last aspect of Pat Akum that we're going to look at is Pat Akum in a mixture. Let's say you have a food which has both bread in it, Pat Akum, and a bishul akum. So you have like a meat pareka. What do? Do you go by the pot, the bread in it, or and then it would be okay, mishum Pat Akum, or do you go by the food in it and it's a problem of a bishul akum, and then the laws of a bishul akum would apply, and the stringencies of a bishul akum would apply. So the Tor, who's the son of the Rush, writes as follows: Katvu hageonim. So the Geonim, the Babylonian rabbis who followed the time of the Babli, they write, Ku'atach sha'oved kochavim mu'ateret. Kutach was this food. It's mentioned a lot in the Gemara. It's like breadcrumbs mixed with milk. So it has both bread in it and it has other food mixed in. So he says these are mu'ateret. You're allowed to eat it. Ein chosheshim lepat sha'oved kochavim shabo. Even so, this is a time when there's still Pat Hakum. So even though there's a bread in it and a non-Jew baked this, we don't worry about the Pat Hakum. We go by the other food in it. So even though there's a crust in this food, it's null in light of the other food it's mixed with. And in that vein, he continues, and the Ri Matir, this is Ri Rabbeinu Yitzchak the Tosafist, he's Matir, he allows the Misha Nizhar Mipat Shalved Kochavim Lechol Be'Ka'ara Imisha Eino Nizhar Mimenu. Let's say you have two people eating, and one person is very careful about Pat Akum, the other person is not careful about Pat Akum. The one who's careful about Pat Akum can eat the food of the one the one who is careful about pat akum can eat the food of the one who is not careful about pat akum. And you don't have to worry that their breads are going to mix together. So if someone is very careful about pat akum, is eating with someone who's not careful about pat akum, and therefore their food might get mixed together, that's okay. You don't have to worry about the one who's not careful's bread getting mixed in. And the Yosef, which Rabbi Yosef Akairo's commentary on the Torah writes as follows on this line of the Torah, where he allows two people to eat together, even where one of them is not careful. Right? This is a view of the Tosafos. And why is it okay? Why is it the one who is careful? Why are they allowed to eat with a person who isn't careful, even though there's a fear that their food will get mixed together? And so the Tosafot explains, even though the bread, the pat akum, will get mixed with the pat Yisrael, ein lahachmir le'asor al yedei ta harovet. We don't prohibit pat akum in a mixture. It doesn't have that power to prohibit in a, once it's mixed with other food. And when the Shulchan Aruch brings down the halakhah, it brings both these rules of the Torah, and the Shulchan Aruch writes in Sif Yud Daled, Siman Kuf Yud Bet, Kutah Shalved Kochavim Mutar. Again, this food where it's crumbs mixed with milk, it's a little bit of salt in there too. If a non-Jew makes it, it is mutar. It's allowed. In Choshim Lepat Oved Kochavim Shabbat. Even if you do observe pat akum, you don't have to worry about the pat akum in this food. And the Rama here adds Haga. And this is the case anytime pat akum is mixed together with other food. Batel berov. The pat akum gets rolled by the majority of the food. So since in the case of the kutach there's more milk than the bread, the milk wins the day, and the whole mixture, the whole food is allowed. And this applies bein pelach, bein beyavesh. This applies whether it's a liquid food or solid, but he adds, but you can't purposely mix pat akum with other food in order that you should be allowed to eat it. And the Shulchan Aruch also adds that two people, one who's careful about pat akum can eat with one who's not careful about pat akum, and you don't have to worry about the food getting mixed together. And the Rama adds that this is not just for a kashrut reason, it's also for a social reason. The Rama adds, Mishum Eva uketata, because you don't want to cause a fight. You don't want to cause a friction between people. That they don't care about pat akum and you do, so you can eat with them and not cause a larger struggle about the issue. And why? Why does this come up specifically with bread? So there's two reasons. And the Rama and the Shach both explain, because ho'il im lo yochel im hem pat sho ikar haseuda hitir lo mishum eba, because bread is like the main part of the meal. So it'll be very noticeable if you don't eat the bread, and that will hurt the person who isn't careful about pat hakum. And the Shach writes this too. It's specifically with bread that there would cause friction between people because everyone needs bread. Bread is the main source of food. But everyone says, and the Rama, go back to the Rama, ein lomod mikam l'shar isurim. You can't infer from this to other prohibitions. I can't say, I'm going to eat by my friend who doesn't keep kosher at all, so I don't hurt them. It's only with pat akum that we allow you to eat with someone who's not careful about it for two reasons. One, we see that bread is the main part of the meal, and it'll be very noticeable if you don't eat. Whereas if you don't eat like their butter, he says, no one will notice. And so the Gra adds, and with this I will be done. Sorry, I'm going 2 minutes over. I just want to complete this. The Gra gives one additional reason why only with regard to bread could you eat with a person who's not careful about it, but this would not apply to other prohibitions. And that is because Yeshna mipnei hamachloket kol she'enu isur deoraita. Pat akum is not really problematic. It's not something which is actually not kosher from the Torah. It's a rabbinic prohibition. So because it's a rabbinic prohibition, and because if you didn't eat it, it would be so glaring, again, mipnei shu ikar seuda, because the bread is the main part of the meal, and it's a rabbinic prohibition. Those two aspects work together to allow you to eat with a person who's not careful about pat hakum. So where it's only a rabbinic prohibition like this, like pat akum, and it's such a big part of the meal, you can eat with a person to avoid machloket, to avoid them feeling hurt, to avoid fight. And with that, we will conclude our study of pat akum. So I think it's a nice place to end. And on the one hand, this is a prohibition whose very foundation is a social preventative measure. We don't eat pat akum to serve the larger goals of intermarriage and keeping Jews Jews. And in that vein, to maintain the peace within Jewish communities, with one neighbors and friends, if you are a person who is careful not to eat pat akum, you can eat with another Jew who's not careful, to maintain the peace and harmony between Jewish neighbors. So on one hand, the same prohibition meant to social distance between Jews and non-Jews. We can also be lenient to keep the harmony and peace and the social relations between Jews. And this is, as we've seen, while pat akum is a prohibition in the Mishnah, we've seen how the lives and the living experience of the Jewish people throughout times has affected how this halakhah is practiced and observed, and why it's something which isn't so relevant nowadays, other than the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we want to have that extra level of holiness to inspire us to do teshuvah. And with that, we will end pat akum. And it's nice that I mentioned milk and this food ku'atach. For next week, we're going to turn to, for our last week, the prohibition against chalav nachri, and why many people do not have a chalav Yisrael nowadays. So have a wonderful week, a good day, or a good night, depending on where you are. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strauch, for another great class. I'm looking forward to the remaining class of this series next Monday. And thank you to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We are going to continue our full program tomorrow at 1 p.m. with the 5th part of a multi-part series by Dr. Hanan Gafni on the origins of academic Jewish studies. In addition, we have many more classes happening right now. You can find more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes, or watch live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again for this opportunity to learn with you, Dr. Schick. And for everyone who attended, we hope to see you soon at one of our upcoming classes at Drisha. Have a wonderful week.